get started because we have a tendency to go over, and we don't want to do that because lunch is next. So we know we're holding you up from food. My name is Lori Thompson, and I am an archivist and digital preservation librarian from Marshall University. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our panel topic, Skeuomorphs in Classic and Contemporary Games. I'm going to jump right in. Our panelists will come up and speak, and then if we have time after, we'll entertain some questions, okay? So skeuomorph is an object or feature which imitates the design of a similar artifact made from another material. Derived from the Greek word skeuos, which means container or implement, and morph or form, the term skeuomorph was originally used in archaeology or architecture to indicate materials that exhibited ornamental designs that mimicked necessary elements in an earlier structure. For example, a clay vessel might contain an etched woven pattern that would harken back to materials made of rope. Or other examples would be faux shutters on houses, spokes on hubcaps, or wood paneling on a vehicle. Archaeologist John Blitz argues that skeuomorphs create acceptance of unfamiliar innovations by reference to objects with pre-existing value through the transfer of familiar design attributes, thus evoking positive social memories associated with the prototype. So in contemporary research, skeuomorphism is most commonly associated with digital design. Computer desktops with icons replicating a floppy disk for saving or a trash can for deleting. Cell phone apps like the Notepad app or the iBooks imitate their real-world counterparts. Sounds can be skeuomorphic as well. For example, the shutter click when taking a selfie on a cell phone, or a ringtone that sounds like a vintage rotary dial phone. Skeuomorphs allow us to keep a thread to the past while simultaneously propelling us into the future. Skeuomorphs have also been instrumental in gaming design. Today, I would like to take a look back in gaming history to pinball. Pinball arose as a creative and technological developments were made in the early 20th century to the game of bagatelle. Bagatelle developed in the 1700s and is described as a cross between billiards and pinball. Originally similar to a full-size billiard game, it was also played with billiard balls and a cue stick. By the late 19th century, parlor bagatelle was developed, as you can see on the left, and it was made of wood, tabletop in design, and used marbles or steel balls. But in 1871, Montague Redgrave received the first U.S. patent for the bagatelle machine. It was entitled Improvements in Bagatelles. Redgrave's machine replaced the cue stick with the first spring-loaded plunger. Some would argue that the 1871 Montague Redgrave machine should have the honors as being dubbed the first pinball game. However, most historians credit David Gottlieb with his release of Baffle Ball in 1931. Due to its popularity with players and operators, Gottlieb had difficulty keeping up supply. Cashing in on that popularity was former Gottlieb distributor Ray Maloney, who created his own game, Ballyhoo. Ballyhoo was also so successful that Maloney renamed his entire company Bally, and the Gottlieb-Bally rivalry began. Pinball became cemented then as a cultural phenomenon. Now, as you can see, some of the skeuomorphic designs throughout the years. Yes? I have no idea. I have to investigate. The competition between Gottlieb and Bally, a handful of other game designers, pushed pinball innovation rapidly in the 30s. Bally's introduction of the bumper and the backboard totalizer on the pinball game, named Bumper, in 36, ushered in a new era for pinball gaming. These bumpers were static, not that pop-style bumper that we're used to today, but their inclusion resulted in the removal of those metal pins from the game. I would therefore argue that the term pinball itself is a skeuomorph, for pins have not existed in the game since the bumper was created. Bumpers were placed also around the playfield in areas where pin groupings had previously existed, an additional example of skeuomorphic design. So they replicated those kind of symmetry. Design elements such as the introduction of backglass, lights, sound, and the aforementioned bumpers were created to draw players, mostly men, to play the games and to entice them to spend their money. I mean, after all, pinball games existed as a means to make money for tavern owners, operators, creators, and even the player. Most of the pinball games during that era were considered payout games, with rewards for highest scores or free games given by tavern owners or the machine itself. During the 30s, pinball games were seen as trade stimulators due to the bleak economy of the Great Depression. Due to the similarities between pinball and gambling bingo games, their skeuomorphic designs were very similar, pinball was considered a game of luck. Many questioned pinball games' legality and legitimacy, and it was famously banned in New York City by Mayor LaGuardia in 1942. Vice squads began destroying games in cities throughout the U.S. Despite pinball production stoppage during World War II and a ban on the machines, the desire to play pinball never diminished. Men had long found pinball a great distraction, but expectations were that women would not or should not play. Sarah Bernard argues that historically women were excluded because of pinball's ties to illicit gambling, and because the games were found predominantly in dens of iniquity, that playing was not something a proper lady would do. But gender roles were challenged during the war, and this included working-class women entering taverns and playing pinball. Historian Eric Fuhr-Slocum argues that controversies reinforced the gender boundaries and separation during leisure time, and that just like any other wartime gender role, neither taverns nor the activities that took place inside them were transformed suddenly into a mixed-gendered establishment. It was also during the 40s that artwork became more elaborate and suggestive, often including scantily clad women front and center to coax men to spend their money, and further drive home the point that pinball was a game for men. The attitudes and dialogue used during this decade in reference to women playing pinball echoes that which is used today in regards to gender representation in gaming culture, and it will be examined by a few of our panelists as well. The most revolutionary innovation to pinball was the invention of the flipper by Gottlieb. The flippers were controlled by buttons on either side of the cabinet. I would argue that this was the beginning of button mashing as a gaming element. The introduction of the flipper challenged the notion that pinball was a game of chance, and it was a precisely designed flipper shot that was responsible for ending prohibition of pinball in New York City in 1976, 30 years after it was enacted. Pinball is now considered a game of skill. Although gameplay was enhanced minimally throughout the decades and after World War II, the next significant change to pinball happened in the 70s. The earliest pinball machines were known as electromechanical, with scoring and sounds created entirely using relays, solenoids, and wires. In the 70s, the computer circuit board technology replaced those old-fashioned relays. This new technology, known as solid-state, ultimately gave rise to the arcade video games and later at-home gaming systems. The Atari Video Pinball advertisement highlights that this game was the world's first attraction to simulate an actual pinball game. It included pinball buttons on the sides of the cabinet, which were also skeuomorphic, and a nudge feature and Atari pinball sounds that all replicated those early pinball machines. Atari designer Ed Lodge stated, "I did not believe video pinball would ever be successful. However, there were places that video games could go that large pinball machines simply could not." So instances of skeuomorphs continue throughout gaming history. Members on this panel today will provide additional examples of how visual, oral, and technical references to the past, made through skeuomorphic design, shape awareness of time during gameplay and when analyzing gaming. Jess Morissette, professor of political science, will discuss the purposes and meanings of video game soda machines. Kristen Steele, visiting assistant professor of English, will discuss the connection between representation of women's bodies and skeuomorphism, and she'll draw a connection between the female body and vending machines. Kristen Lilvis, associate professor of English, will discuss skeuomorphs in Williams' trizone, including images of women and the machine itself as a skeuomorphs. Allison Carey, associate professor of English, will discuss perspectives on the intersections of human and machine, and from Italian futurism through post-humanism. And throughout our presentation today, you will see examples of our digital version of the pinball game Trizone, created by Matt Mendel, an assistant professor in the Computer and Information Department at Marshall University. And this game is fully functional and playing on its own.
Well, thank you. When I think of skeuomorphs, the definition that jumps to mind for me is a digital representation of some kind of material interface. And today in my section of the talk, I'm going to be talking about an interface that we all know and love, the soda machine, specifically soda machines that appear in video games. For the past year and a half, I've been collecting screenshots of soda machines from video games. Like all the best research, this started out as a joke. I posted on Twitter a couple of screenshots and I said, hey, somebody should start collecting these things and make an archive of them. And very quickly, yes.
Tell me you got much fun.
Yes, it's on there. Thank you. Yes, I said somebody should start collecting these things, and very quickly that somebody became me. And I've collected a lot of these screenshots. In the past year and a half, I've found over 2,000 soda machines, all archived online. If you Google video game soda machine, you can find the site. From more than 1,000 games across every platform, every genre imaginable. And as my collection's grown, what started off as something of a joke evolved into something that involved me thinking a little bit more deeply about the purposes and the meanings that these video game soda machines and the interfaces that so closely mirror those that we know from our actual lives, how that all broke down. And what I began doing is working through a methodology introduced originally by Consalvo and Dutton called the object inventory, where I began recording instances where these soda machines appeared, recording the sorts of context within which they were presented in the games, options for interactivity, and ultimately using this to reflect upon the broader socio-cultural meaning of these soda machines. Of course, the most fundamental level at which a player is likely to interact with a video game soda machine, and the most immediate level, is visually. And one of the early explanations I arrived at for this question, why are there so many of these things? Why are they such a recurring trope? Was simply the fact that soda machines are relatively easy to recreate in virtual environments. This screenshot is from a 1985 game called Brain Breaker for the Sharp X1 personal computer. And as you can see there, just to give some context here, that soda machine that's represented is 8 pixels wide by 16 pixels tall. It's only 6 colors. And what I think is fascinating about this screenshot is you can really see the ease with which you can reproduce so many elements that signify soda machine, including the interface. There are 4 distinct cans of soda represented here. There's a coin slot. There's a dispensing tray. There's something that manages to evoke the Coca-Cola wave without infringing on any trademarks in doing so. That all signals to us, yeah, this is a soda machine. I think part of why they appear so frequently is, yes, this is an interface and an artifact of the real world that's easy to create in a virtual environment. Even in more modern games, where we might have 3D environments, oftentimes creating something like a soda machine may be as simple as taking a 3D box texture or a model and layering a 2D texture over it. I have an acquaintance who works in video game environment design, and he describes soda machines as a cube that does something. And I think that's a powerful description, and that, again, it gets to the simplicity with which these might be implemented. Maybe that's part of the puzzle of why they appear so frequently. And when they appear in these various contexts, we see them play not only this aesthetic role, but oftentimes they enter into gameplay as well. They tend to have a ludic function of some sort. They also have narrative functions. Sometimes they're part of even telling the story of video games. These soda machines are from Deus Ex: Mankind Divided, a game that is thematically centered on a clash between cybernetically augmented humans and societal tensions they face with regards to baseline unaugmented humans. And we see that reflected narratively through these soda machines in the sense of, it's maybe a little difficult to see here, but the slogans on these machines read, "Machines cannot taste, but your tongue does. Keep it real." And the other says, the Ashanti energy drink, they may have batteries, but we got this. Using these soda machines as an opportunity to advance the story, the themes of the game. In other instances where they may enter into gameplay more directly, a soda machine may be simply something you might jump on top of to reach the area of a level that's otherwise inaccessible, or something you punch so that coins come spewing out. But the most common function in terms of gameplay that these soda machines seem to serve, based on my research, is as a means of restoring the player's health or providing some kind of temporary power-up. And I think what's fascinating about this is the fact that, in this regard, these machines are once again recreating something we know from our day-to-day lives. For how many of us is it maybe a daily ritual when we need a power-up of our own? Maybe not one that'll help us throw fireballs or anything like that, but simply a caffeine boost to get through the remainder of our day. Do we turn to these, real-world soda machines? It's ironic, of course, that, in a video game world, a soda machine may restore health. I don't know that many of us would say sodas are a particularly restorative, healthy drink in the real world, but certainly this seems to be a stand-in, a ludic stand-in for a very real-world phenomenon, the refreshment and possible energy boost that we see from soda. And when we take these aesthetic, narrative, ludic elements of video game soda machines together, I say they argued that they create a very powerful force. Specifically, these soda machines help ground video games in a reality that players recognize as fundamentally similar to their own. They establish a sense of what scholars have called presence, particularly in game environments that have any number of unfamiliar elements. Say a science fiction game where everything's very different, but maybe a soda machine is a touchstone of modernity we can recognize. Or a fantasy game where maybe they appear under the guise of a machine that dispenses potions. What is a mana potion if it isn't just a fantasy magic soda, right? In this sense, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, or this screenshot from The Secret of Monkey Island, where we see a grog machine anachronistically appear during a game set in the golden age of piracy, they provide this sense of presence. Scholars define presence as a sense of being there. That's how McMahon describes it. Others, Lombard and Ditton, suggest that presence provides a virtual experience that feels natural, immediate, direct, and real. Fincott emphasizes the role of what he calls sureties as establishing this sense of presence. He calls these sureties mundane details that somehow feel highly predictable. Something in virtual environments that makes virtual environments feel real to us. In this sense, I think this is maybe one of the most powerful roles that these soda machines play. They represent an interface and an object that we recognize from our day-to-day lives. And in turn, we can anticipate a range of likely interactions with a soda machine when we see one in a video game. Just like when we see one here on campus, we know what it is and we know what to do with it. The same can be said when we see this interface reproduced within a video game environment. This concept of presence originally was developed in the film of virtual reality studies, talking about how to make virtual reality environments feel like a real world in which we're normally interacting. I think it carries over here quite aptly, because again, these soda machines essentially are serving as familiar, predictable objects that connect gamers' environments to their actual lives, thus creating a sense of realism and, just as importantly, strengthening this presence. In turn, something as simple as a red rectangle on screen with the word cola on it has a powerful capacity for grounding players in a world they immediately recognize as real. And to extrapolate this to yet another level of skeuomorphic meta-weirdness, I've actually brought along a physical recreation of a digital soda machine from the game Fallout 4, which of course itself is a digital recreation of something we know from the real world. So this extrapolates it yet another level with this functioning mini refrigerator that I've brought along today, which itself, I notice as I'm standing here, has skeuomorphic venting painted onto the side of it to mimic the sorts of vents that would normally be present on one of these refrigerated items. So all that being said, if soda machines so often serve as a touchstone for modernity in video games, what does that say about modernity? Video game soda machines, I argue, reflect and reinforce in many ways the consumerist values of modern capitalism. When we think of a soda machine, we think of soda companies in the beverage industry. We see so many signifiers of modern capitalism all coalescing, whether it's advertising, brand affinity, convenience, conspicuous consumption, disposability, impulse buying, shopping as a cultural practice. The list goes on and on. All of these sorts of norms that we associate with consumerism, in many ways the soda machine is emblematic of that. And it's perhaps fair to say that game environments that we experience to some degree are only real in so much as they reproduce the same signifiers of capitalism that surround gamers on a daily basis. Simply put, a world without capitalism and signifiers of capitalism like soda machines and any numbers of other objects we're likely to encounter in games simply feel fake. It's one thing to ask gamers to imagine a world full of zombies, dragons, cyborgs, wizards, princesses, but it's another thing to ask them to imagine a world without capitalism. That seems like a little bit of a stretch for people who are used to having their imagination stretched by this medium. So in that sense, yeah, by providing presence, by grounding us in a world we recognize as our own, while at the same time recreating and reinforcing these values of consumerism, I think in a lot of ways that's the true purpose and ultimately the meaning that these soda machines as an in-game object perform. So in that sense, having talked about in-game objects, I'm going to turn things over to Kristen, who's going to speak to you a little bit about objectification in video games. Thank you.
Hi. If we want to talk about women's bodies as skeuomorphs in video games, we must first look at how those bodies were used to sell the games themselves. Here we see an ad for the first commercially sold video game ever made, which was Computer Space in 1971. We see here a woman passive in white sheer attire in which we can actually see her underwear that aligns with the controls of the game itself. This isn't the first time that we've seen women within this position. We've seen these women many times before. The commodification of bodies in the passive position calls to mind advertisements prior to the era of the Computer Space game. Here we see women selling household appliances in mid-20th century advertisements. On the far left there, face of wood, body of steel, we have a woman who's standing next to a stove. Next, we have a woman selling an ad. We have a woman selling a stove, an appliance that promises stacked for convenience. And then most important here on the right, we have an advertisement for Frigidaire. It's lovely to look at. It's loaded with features. It's lots for the money. This positioning of the women in these ads present the appliance in a way in which we see women selling things following this. Even now we have video games on TV. We still see these women in TV game shows when they present things such as Wheel of Fortune. We see Vanna White. We have The Price is Right, in which women present something that promises us a future that we hope to attain. Later in the 80s, we continue to see advertisements using women as a marketing point. Here on the left, for a Deadeye game, we have a woman holding a gun, aim for higher earnings. Here on the right, we have an advertisement for Atari with Barrel Pong, in which a woman puts a coin into the machine for gameplay time. This again calls to mind the woman presenting these appliances and thus viewing the game as a type of vending machine. We put something in, we get pleasure out. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto is the fourth highest selling video game franchise after Mario, Pokemon, and Tetris.
Within Grand Theft Auto 5, we have 3 male protagonists, dozens of characters, one of which is a woman by the name of Taliana Martinez. And she's the only woman, as critics describes, that isn't the butt of a joke within this particular game. Grand Theft Auto, the series itself, has been accused of sexism, often featuring strip clubs, robberies, and murders that come to us easily within the narratives that take place within the game. Here I want to focus on a particular character named Trevor. We begin to see a dichotomy set up here within storytelling mode of this game as Trevor follows and harasses one particular female character. Here he follows her, saying things to her that, such as she makes him want to have a lobotomy, that she doesn't deserve to be walking on the earth. And so as she walks away from him, this suggests that even though he is trying to taunt her, even though he is trying to get her to engage with him, that she is of no use to him because she will not engage and will not give him what he is asking. Next, to follow up with this dichotomy among women, we'll take Trevor here with his friend into the strip club. Again, here in story mode of the game, we see this male protagonist walking into the club here on the far left, and two approaching strippers come up to him. As one person goes to sit down with the stripper in order to receive a lap dance, we can see, as the player, the ability to throw money at this particular woman. I want to call your attention here to the controls at the bottom. Use R to look around. Press X to toss a dollar. Press square to make it rain. Press, I think that's a circle, to leave the rail. And so here we literally throw woman at the money, hoping to get pleasure from her. Here what we're actually seeing are screenshots of a YouTube video in which we are promised that if we go through this particular process, that we can take this stripper out of the strip club and get her into our home, in which from there we will impregnate her. Interestingly enough, because this YouTube video instructs players on how to get a girlfriend and impregnate her, players actually debate whether or not this can happen within Grand Theft Auto 5. This is also interesting because even though the game itself is sort of marketed as satire, we then follow up the game with several YouTube videos that they themselves are arguably satire for the game. In this last shot here, we're brought to the point in which that we hope to engage with this particular woman through the headset. So here, as we toss the money to her, as we speak to her within the headset, this figure is reduced to an object within the context of the game, to an appliance, to what I'm going to call a dancing vending machine. She is here only for our use. We give her money, we take away her agency, and we get to move through the game with a particular girlfriend, as noted, in our phone when we leave the strip club. Here we're brought to a liminal space between fantasy and reality, a space between satire and some of the most disgusting truths of our own reality. I question that within the world of Grand Theft Auto, if this isn't unlike staging a house. Staging a house within the ads that, staging a house within the ads that we see with women in the mid-20th century, presenting a promise for those who can buy those appliances. This is a domestic space in which women, as we know, were long shackled to, and so this makes me question if within this game, if we're actually staging a world to elicit a response in players, calling on the materiality of fantasy that's only possible for them in the world of the game, which includes interaction with, possession of, and power over these women, which are merely skeuomorphic. Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to that idea of reality and thinking about skeuomorphs in reality, and including women's bodies. And so understanding how skeuomorphs ground games and their players in reality requires an exploration of temporality. As Lori said at the beginning, skeuomorphs exist in time and space, bringing the past, present, and future together. Much of the scholarship on skeuomorphs focuses on time by exploring whether skeuomorphs are fundamentally conservative or progressive. So are they really rooted in the past, or are they pushing us forward? Jeremy Wade Morris argues that although skeuomorphs are crucial for innovation, they must ultimately be viewed as conservative because they perpetuate old patterns, practices, and conceptual frameworks. Morris relies on physical metaphors to explain skeuomorphs' indebtedness to history, noting that they represent the material weight of the past on the present and the future. Skeuomorphs themselves are material metaphors, given that they embody the relationship between the past and future in their physical, visual, or auditory presence. If they materially represent no longer necessary design features, we can perhaps say that they are fundamentally conservative. Yet, skeuomorphs push those who interact with them forward into the future. Nicholas Gessler asserts that skeuomorphs function as informational attributes of artifacts which help us find a new path through unfamiliar territory. This move into unfamiliar territory, or the new, shows that while the past is ever present, skeuomorphs look to past and future simultaneously, reinforcing and undermining both. And Catherine Hales asserts that the skeuomorph calls into play a psychodynamic that finds the new more acceptable when it recalls the old that it is in the process of displacing, and finds the traditional more comfortable when it is presented in a context that reminds us we can escape from it into the new. This second part of Hales' definition, that the skeuomorphs evoke the paradoxical human desire to take comfort in tradition but also escape from the traditional into the new, is what holds the most significance for me in the discussion of skeuomorphs in games today. Skeuomorphic representation of women's bodies, to continue with that idea, in pinball suggests that the players escape into the new setting of the game, and the new environment of gameplay requires the comfort of patriarchal representations of women's bodies. These images ground the player's body in some kind of reality, but what if the machine itself is a skeuomorph? What traditions does pinball evoke to ease the player into what I think is a new future of human-machine integration? Williams' Trizone is a good game to investigate because of its averageness. It's a solid-state machine that was released in July of 1979, and it brings together the new and the old. It's the first pinball built on the Williams System 6 platform and has a fully digital display, but it serves as a precursor to more modern pinball machines that boast multi-ball and multi-level or digitally enhanced playfields. Ads for the machine targeted at business owners proclaim that the game offers a new dimension in futuristic fantasy. And specifically, the ads state that the machine features the greatest audio turn-on in pinball play imaginable, with details about staccato sound thrills, echoing and ringing satellites of sound, and a resounding squadron of sound excitement from another dimension. So while the digital sounds were a new feature at the time, looking back, this focus is actually pretty interesting because the machine doesn't include speech sounds, which were introduced by Williams with Gorgar the same year, nor does it include continuous background sound, which was also released the same year, again by Williams, with Flash. So there's this paradox happening there. The interplay of new and old does appear again, though, when considering the images of Trizone. One advertisement for Trizone boasts of the game's extra-dimensional visual effect. The back glass, as you can see here, features 5 women. There's 3 prominent. There's 2 women sort of at the bottom under the 4th player bar. And we have 2 men featured prominently with additional characters who are ambiguously gendered. Compared to the female arm candy in car-centric movies of the 1970s, the women of Trizone seem empowered and progressive. All of the characters, men and women, are futuristic race car drivers, and the women are either standing or sitting in front of the men, and they seem to dominate them. We have one woman putting her arm around the man. The woman in the center of the back glass is the object of the gaze, though, for the male and female characters in the primary scene, but perhaps their look is not controlling. They're all very clearly looking into her eyes rather than at other parts of her body. The direction of the character's gaze gains additional significance when contrasted with that of the player. Her costuming and the costuming of the other women draws the player's eyes to her body first. And this is amplified when backlights are considered because the placement of bulbs and also the color of her skin, which is yellow so it glows very brightly, makes it pretty clear what the player is looking at. So to think about the gaze, to briefly summarize Mulvey, the gaze for the film spectator is either voyeuristic or fetishistic. With the first, voyeuristic scopophilia, and that being the love or pleasure of looking, the viewer attempts to control the object of the gaze, typically the woman, by assigning her guilt and asserting control and subjecting the guilty person through punishment or forgiveness. So the viewer takes pleasure in seeing the woman punished on screen. Fetishistic scopophilia conversely turns the object of the gaze into a fetish so that it becomes reassuring rather than dangerous. The viewer doesn't have to watch the woman's male counterpart punish her, but instead interacts with her directly, building up the physical beauty of the woman until it becomes something satisfying in itself. Film, of course, differs from pinball, and in pinball, the player's interactions with the images of women make the fetishistic aspect of looking more evident. Scholars have considered the gaze in terms of video games and the player's interaction with NPCs, but pinball offers a new avenue because the player interacts with the machine, but in the case of Trizone at least, the women remain static. They exist as fetish objects, giving reassurance during gameplay in a way that recalls the ability of Skeuomorphs to offer comfort through their reference to tradition. If the environment of the game is perilous, perhaps not so much in its theme, but as in the threat of loss, or if you've owned a pinball machine in the frequency of malfunction, then a quick glance at the back glass can offer the player the pleasure of the gaze. But if Skeuomorphs not only allow users to take comfort in tradition, but also escape into the new, how do the bodies of Trizone function, and how do they shape interactions with the machine itself? Charles Suckup argues that recent conventions in filmmaking have resulted in a technoscopophilia, or a view of technology as an object of fantasy and pleasure, in the same way the sexualized body gives the viewer pleasure. Extending technoscopophilia from film to video games, and here pinball, I find the blurring of boundaries between human and machine in Trizone offers players a new path forward, a move from the pleasure of fetishization to the fantasy of separation or distinction. Just as the women on the back glass intersect with the game's racetracks, and we can see the curves giving us some connection to their breasts and their buttocks, the player interacts or intersects with Trizone, using hands to control the flippers and hips to nudge the machine. And yes, if you Google it, there are instructions on how to pick up a partner by perfecting your nudging techniques. Here's where tradition and innovation meet when thinking about Trizone and its women as Skeuomorphs. Visual and tactile pleasures ease the players into the union of human and machine by offering the skeuomorphic fantasy that while the other, the woman on the back glass, is integrated with technology, the player still dominates the machine. Again, though, this separation is merely a fantasy, and as Allison's going to discuss, there's much more to that human-machine relationship than meets the eye.
So in gaming and in our other daily interfaces with technology, our bodies are increasingly skeuomorphic. In making that argument, I rely on Gessler's description of skeuomorphs, which Kristen shared with you a moment ago, when Gessler wrote that skeuomorphs are, quote, material metaphors, informational attributes of artifacts, which help us find a path through unfamiliar territory. Just as the design features of skeuomorphic objects are the result of nostalgia, are the traces of familiarity within the unfamiliar, our bodies are also inspiring nostalgia, even when their functions aren't as necessary or as optimal as they once were. In Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, Jane Bennett describes a quality of objects that she calls vital materiality. Bennett describes that vitality as, quote,
the capacity of things, edibles, commodities, storms, metals, not only to impede or block the will and designs of humans, but also to act as quasi-agents or forces with trajectories, propensities, and tendencies of their own. Applying that definition to games and gaming, and thinking of those as being quasi-agents or forces with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own, inevitably evokes images of the Terminator and the inevitable rise of the machines. But for Bennett, vital materiality of objects, including our metallic companions, is not the stuff of dystopian despair. Rather, Bennett hopes that this understanding of objects can help us to, quote, dissipate the binaries of life matter, human animal, will determination, and organic inorganic to induce in human bodies an aesthetic affective openness to material vitality. Bennett writes specifically about the material vitality of metal, a substance that's a key component of the machine age, the information age, and of course of gaming. Bennett discusses metal's interior structure and its external surface with which we humans interact. And she makes a crucial point about the relationship between metal and time and about metal's speed, if you will. She notes that, quote, objects appear as such because their becoming proceeds at a speed or level below the threshold of human discernment. Therefore, as humans, we read solid objects, such as these games, comprised of metal and glass and plastic and paint, as not us, because their speed, specifically their pace of change, is so gradual. Their time is not our time. In Nicholas Gessler's essay, Skeuomorphs and Cultural Algorithms, he also discusses the speed of material change, comparing the rates of reproduction for biological information in DNA, cultural information, and technological information. In making this comparison, Gessler acknowledges that sexual reproduction and culture may have their advantages over technology. He notes that, quote, sex may be more immersive, culture may be more inspirational, but Gessler maintains that technology beats them both for the speed of its reproduction. Quote, technology has upped biology's pace 1,000-fold in 1/100 millionth of the time. In this larger discussion of games as objects or independent agents, please note how consistently the argument circles back around to sex and reproduction, to the same commodity being sold, along with a game console, in the 1971 ad for the computer space arcade game. When thinking about the interface of human and machine, it always does seem to come back to sex. And this preoccupation is not at all new. That sentiment comes through especially clearly in a 1957 film entitled The Desk Set, in which real-life partners, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, play, respectively, the head of a television network's research department and a computer inventor. Everyone in the network research department thinks that the computer, which is anthropomorphized and feminized by being called Miss Emmy, will replace them, although Katharine Hepburn's character succinctly notes Miss Emmy's one true inability, sex.
Yes, it's Spencer Tracy. Yes, it's...
This was working earlier.
Spencer Tracy.
I'm going to unplug and play it again for just a second.
Okay. Technology.
As you've never seen him before. And Katharine Hepburn. As you've always
Are you getting that at all? Okay.
wanted to see her. They'll have you rocking and rolling with laughter as they match wits with Miss Emmy, the machine that can replace everybody except a woman like Katie. Wow.
What are you thinking, Bunny? Except for sex, what's left?
With all of this attention to machines and sex, Should we believe that the feminization of games is the skeuomorph, helping us to transition from the familiar past into the unfamiliar future? Or is sex itself a skeuomorph, the non-functional detail that through its familiarity breeds nostalgia? This exploration of boundaries and features and definitions of human and machine and the sexualization of machines has a history far longer than that of gaming or a 1957 movie. Inspired by Trizone's advertising language about the ultimate integration of futuristic sound with scoring power, I would like to focus for a moment on futurism itself, the early 20th century avant-garde movement.
Yes, it's Spencer.
Not seeing that again. The early 20th century avant-garde movement and its charismatic creator, F.T. Marinetti. Marinetti adored and eroticized the machine, a sentiment he expressed in texts such as his 1915 essay, Extended Man and the Kingdom of the Machine, in which he celebrates mechanical beauty and engines that, quote, glistened sensuously. For Marinetti, the appeal of machines, such as automobiles and airplanes, hinged not only on their sexiness, but also on their capacity for speed. Marinetti argues that the appeal of speed resides in its relationship to time. Quote, speed destroys the laws of gravity, makes the values of time and space subjective, and in one of Marinetti's most extended reflections on speed, The New Ethical Religion of Speed, he highlights the physical pleasures available through speed, at one point advocating traveling in a train's dining car because it not only provides the pleasures of eating, but also privileges, quote, that very special pleasure of feeling oneself to be a speeding body. In Marinetti's work, he especially endorsed machines that could help someone move fast. Machines of transportation, like the automobile and airplane, are figured as both the savior of and a supplement to mankind because, as he argued, speed remakes time and temporarily undermines the limitations of time and, by association, the limitations of the past. By moving fast with the help of machines such as the automobile and airplane, humans are able to rewrite the rules of time and space, if only for a moment. Marinetti's critical writings repeatedly highlight the need to escape from or destroy the past, and he attributes to speed specifically the power to escape that past. Marinetti calls the past, quote, our most dangerous enemy. For Marinetti, the past carries a valence of gloomy mood, it's fawning, it's enervating or weakening. He despises history, he calls it a falsifier, or at best, a miserable little stamp collector. In contrast, Marinetti offers, quote, the tragic lyricism of speed for a subject who is both man and machine, quote, extended man who fuses with iron, who feeds upon electricity and understands nothing beyond the desire for danger and day-to-day heroism. I can't talk about early 20th century avant-garde fascination with technology without mentioning the machine portraits by French artist Francis Picabia. These were impressionistic portraits of various people rendered as drawings of lamps, cameras, flashlights, and even schematics of electrical systems. The best known of these is this one, Portrait of a Young American Girl in a State of Nudity, a precisely rendered image of a spark plug on which is inscribed the words forever, placed vertically on the body of the spark plug, presumably the young woman's torso. Art critics have discussed the work's relationship to the machine age and the title's sexual connotations. Elizabeth Hutton Turner, for example, examined the correlation between spark plugs and the popular contemporary image of young American women in the 19-teens. And she noted that, quote, the young American woman is a catalyst for modernization, analogous to a mass-produced interchangeable part like the spark plug, and that her insignia, forever, guaranteed perpetual satisfaction and activity. Notable in Picabia's image here is the lack of fusion between machine and human being, a fusion that Jane Bennett had implied in her description of vital materiality and that Marinetti had called for in Extended Man in the Kingdom of the Machine. Instead, in this portrait, the machine has usurped the human position, serving as a replacement for rather than a supplement to the human subject. When discussing this particular machine portrait, other scholars mention futurism in Marinetti because Paccabia's sexualization of this image so closely resembles Marinetti's treatment of machines. Marinetti's sexualization and pointedly feminization of machines is particularly apparent in Extended Man in the Kingdom of the Machine, when he describes a locomotive driver caressing the steel that had so often glistened sensuously between the lubricating caress of his hand. Marinetti makes this sexual metaphor completely explicit when he claims that an engine driver lovingly washing the great powerful body of the engine uses the same little acts of tenderness and close familiarity as the lover when caressing his beloved. Ultimately, Marinetti predicts a fusion of man and machine that will result in, quote, the formation of the non-human mechanical species of extended man. This unification with machine will allow humankind in the future to rule supreme over conquered time and space. Which brings us back to where we began in this panel, skeuomorphs and their function of helping us to usher ourselves into the future. As Kristen pointed out, skeuomorphs are kind of inherently contradictory. If skeuomorphs are, as Gusler suggests, a means of easing our transition into the future by keeping one foot firmly planted in the past, then they are humanity's attempt to maintain the illusion of control in the face of an uncertain future. If machines are, as Marinetti argued, the enemy of the past, our way to destroy nostalgia, then what does it mean when our machines are shaped by multiple nostalgias? Nostalgia for other machines, like soda machines, nostalgia for the feminized sexual body, and finally, nostalgia for our own pre-machine selves. And, appropriately enough, I am out of time.